Vietnam furthers economic ties with Malaysia and Singapore. Prospects for Vietnam-EU Free Trade Agreement. Hello from Hanoi and thank you for tuning into this episode of Bizline brought to you by VTV International. My name is Hương and as usual we'll start with several economic highlights for the past week. During Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng official visit to Malaysia late last week, the two governments announced the establishment of a bilateral strategic partnership, laying the foundation for further cooperation in trade and investment, amongst others. Both sides witnessed the signing of a memorandum of understanding between Petronas and PetroVietnam and the granting of a certificate to the Malaysian bank CIMB to open a wholly foreign-owned bank in Vietnam. Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng also attended a dialogue held by the ASEAN Business Club in Malaysia, where he urged businesses of the two countries to further cooperate. Malaysia is currently one of the top investors in Vietnam, with 500 projects worth $11 billion. The bilateral trade turnover has surpassed $8 billion. Later, during his official visit to Singapore, Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng attended a roundtable seminar with leading Singaporean enterprises. At the seminar, representatives from the Singapore Business Federation said 97% of its enterprises have ranked Vietnam fourth in potential investment markets. Leading Singaporean investors in Vietnam such as Sembcorp, Capitaland and Tung Lo Capital revealed their plans to expand investment in infrastructure, industrial parks, oil and gas, commercial centers, housing and offices. The State Bank of Vietnam on Wednesday announced the adjustment of the exchange rate band from ±1% to ±2%. The average interbank Vietnamese dong US dollar exchange rate is 21,673 Vietnamese dong, with a ceiling rate of 22,106 Vietnamese dong and a floor rate of 21,240 Vietnamese dong. The decision is due to unpredictable factors in the global economy. The most influential factor is said to be the devaluation of the Chinese yuan. Economists have voiced concerns of an increased risk of a trade deficit for Vietnam's economy because of this devaluation. Results of the 19th quarterly Eurocharm Business Climate Index survey conducted in July show the business confidence, outlook and expectations for the future among European businesses in Vietnam rose slightly from the previous quarter. During the second quarter of 2015, the Business Climate Index rose to 77 points from a previous quarterly score of 75. In response to the question of how businesses perceived their general business situation, 57% of respondents said it was good, a notable rise from the previous quarters. The participants expected that over the next 6 months, the market would see a fall in inflation rate from 5.25 to 3.4%. Vietnam's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development and Japan's Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries jointly held a ministerial meeting on Wednesday in Hanoi. At the meeting, both sides announced the medium and long-term vision of Japan-Vietnam cooperation for Vietnamese agriculture. The vision will take effect from 2015 to 2019, focusing on three main areas, namely food supply chain, adaptation to climate change, and human resource training. On the same day, Vietnamese and Japanese enterprises also took part in a dialogue on cooperation in agriculture. A report on how businesses have gritted tax administration procedures was issued on Tuesday. Accordingly, more than 71% of enterprises are satisfied with tax procedures. The results were provided from a survey of 2,500 enterprises across the country, conducted by the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry (VCCI), General Department of Taxation, World Bank Vietnam, and some other tax agencies. In the coming time, the tax authorities are determined to reduce the number of hours firms have to spend on completing their tax procedures as part of wider government efforts to boost the economy's efficiency. According to the General Statistics Office, the country spent $3.4 billion on imports of new cars and spare parts during the first 7 months of this year. The figure is up by 88% compared to the same period last year. Notably, some 65,000 completely built-up cars were imported worth over $1.7 billion. Most came from China, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and India. Meanwhile, according to the Vietnam Automobile Manufacturers Association, sales revenue was up 59% year-on-year. Experts forecast that domestic car sales will reach 200,000 cars in 2015 thanks to the annual surge towards the end of this year. Those are highlights in the economic scene for the past week. Up next, we'll talk about the prospects for Vietnam-EU Free Trade Agreement in our crosstalk.
Vietnamese Minister of Industry and Trade Vũ Huy Hoàng and European Commissioner Karel de Gucht officially announced the launch of free trade negotiations between Vietnam and the EU on June 26, 2012. The two sides have their own objectives in the negotiation. Vietnam wanted to expand exports of textiles, footwear, agricultural and fishery products to the EU, while European countries were looking for investment opportunities and markets for their technology and services. After 13 rounds of negotiations, the final package of commitments related to intellectual property rights, government procurement saw the two sides come close to agreement. After 2.5 years and 14 rounds of negotiations, Vietnam and the EU reached an agreement in principle on the free trade agreement. Vietnam is the second country after Singapore to have signed a free trade agreement with the EU. Vietnam will have greater competitive advantage than countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, and China in exporting products to the EU.
Vietnam and the European Union announced their agreement in principle of the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, or EVFTA, on August 4th, after over 2 years of negotiations. This is the most ambitious and comprehensive trade agreement that the EU has ever concluded with a developing country such as Vietnam. To find out more about this trade agreement and the potential it has for both sides, we have invited to our studio today Ambassador Franz Jessen, head of the delegation of the European Union to Vietnam. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us in our show today.
It's great being here. Thank you.
Vietnam and the European Union recently announced the end of negotiations of the EVFTA. How would you assess the new opportunities that this free trade agreement will bring to both sides?
I think it has great opportunities for both sides, but maybe in particular for Vietnam, because Vietnam is still developing. It means that the Vietnamese economy is expected to grow relatively rapidly over the next decades. And therefore, it's important for Vietnam to have good access to a big developed market such as the EU market. What we look at from the EU side is partly to have opportunities to produce in Vietnam, and there are two things we do there. One is to produce for the Vietnamese market, but the other one is to produce for exports to other parts of the world, many of them back to Europe. And the free trade agreement that will help greatly for European investments into Vietnam, and it's going to help a lot for Vietnamese trade to Europe.
The EVFTA is the second trade agreement that the EU has ever concluded with an ASEAN country, the first being Singapore. Why Vietnam?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think one reason was, of course, that Vietnam was interested, but other ASEAN countries are interested too. The other reason could be that we have a very good political relationship with Vietnam that made the agreement to have an FTA quite easy to agree on the two sides. And I think that was important. We also were fortunate that our negotiators in the Ministry of Trade here in Hanoi and in the Brussels Commission, the DG Trade we have there, the two sets of negotiators, they know each other very well, and they're familiar with each other. And it made that the different difficulties that we had during the negotiations were relatively easy to overcome because there was a high degree of trust between them.
It will remove nearly all tariffs on goods traded between us. It covers services, investment, and issues such as government procurement. We have now taken then a major step in our trade relations.
The EU-Vietnam FTA will eliminate over 99% of tariff lines. Vietnam will liberalize 65% of import duties on EU exports to Vietnam at entry, with the remainder of duties being gradually eliminated over a 10-year period. EU duties will be eliminated over a 7-year period.
Khi hiệp định được ký kết và có hiệu lực, tôi chỉ nói riêng về vấn đề mở cửa thị trường. Theo tính toán thì chúng ta sẽ tăng được từ 4 cho đến 6% kim ngạch xuất khẩu hàng năm so với cái mức tăng bình thường không có hiệp định.
In addition, Vietnam has committed to improve access for EU companies to a broad range of service sectors, including business and environmental services, banking, and insurance. It has also accepted a set of regulatory disciplines in key sectors such as financial services, telecommunications, maritime transport, and postal services. The two sides also agreed upon promoting and protecting bilateral investment.
Chí ít là trong 5-10 năm nữa thì Việt Nam chưa có khả năng nhiều về đầu tư sang EU. Việt Nam cũng chưa có khả năng nhiều việc cung cấp dịch vụ vào thị trường EU. Trong khi đấy, những lĩnh vực ấy là lĩnh vực rất mạnh của EU, cho nên là tức là gì? Chúng ta có lợi ích chúng ta chủ yếu tập trung ở thương mại hóa. Còn lợi ích của phía EU lại chủ yếu tập trung ở cái lĩnh vực tức là dịch vụ rồi mua sắm chính phủ vân vân.
EU companies will be able to bid for public contracts in Vietnam. EU businesses will be the first foreign companies to get such a level of access to Vietnam's procurement markets.
Our previous report just points out several basics of the EVFTA. How do you think this free trade agreement will affect the bilateral trade and investment between Vietnam and the EU?
I think it's going to increase both. It's going to increase trade rapidly and also investment, in particular investments from Europe to Vietnam, of course, because that's where we see the flow right now. In terms of trade, we have that the Vietnamese exports to Europe are growing very quickly already, 15% more or less in average per year. And that growth rate I would expect to be even faster for two reasons. One is that the access to the European market will be easier. And the other one is what I mentioned earlier, that I would expect more investments coming into Vietnam from Europe, and many of those investments will be focusing on selling products on the European market afterwards. So that's going to help the exports from Vietnam.
One of the provisions of the EVFTA is that European companies are now able to bid for public contracts in Vietnam. Could you tell us more about this provision?
Yeah, I think it's a very good example on how the FTA benefits both sides. It benefits European companies, as you say, because they're able now to bid in some public procurement contracts here in Vietnam, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City in particular. So that would help European companies to participate in the market here. But for me, it's equally important that it increases the transparency of the procurement system. And that benefits not only European companies, but also Vietnamese companies operating here in Vietnam. It also benefits the taxpayer, because it makes procurement more efficient in our view. So it means that the cost of building things should go down, and therefore it benefits the Vietnamese economy.
Mm-hmm. What other sectors, in your opinion, will benefit most from this FTA?
I think in the short run, the sectors that are doing well today will do even better in future. So that's electronics. It's agricultural products such as coffee, tea, for example. We will have a number of products such as furniture products, where Vietnam is very competitive and they'll do even better in future. Textile products, I expect. So the sectors that we look at today, I think, will be enhanced when we look forward. But over time, I expect that we'll see a number of new sectors appearing, sectors that we are not aware of today, because today they're relatively less important, but in future I would expect that they will come as well. And there again, I think the quality of the Vietnamese labor force will kick in and help the economy.
Tell us more about the opportunities for European exporters once the FTA is signed.
Many European companies has a great strength in machine tools, so I expect that sector to benefit in line with the increased investments into Vietnam from Europe. But you also have other products such as wine, alcohol, where Europe tends to be very, very competitive, very high quality and well-priced products. So they will also do well. Across the board, I would say high-tech goods from Europe will do well after the FTA.
Thanks to the EV FTA, European goods, services and investment will gain easier access to Vietnamese market. In the following clip, we'll take a look at the European coverage of the advantages that European companies will gain once they enter Vietnamese market.
While Vietnamese enterprises are becoming more aware of the opportunities and challenges posed by the EV FTA, the media and newspaper in EU member countries have expressed positive views about the FTA. The British media has positive review about the potential consumption of alcohol and beverages products in Vietnam, especially given the popularity of Scotch whisky. Germany's HNA looks at Vietnam as a new attractive destination for investment. The newspaper quoted that with half of Samsung mobile devices sold worldwide are made in Vietnam, Vietnam is even more attractive than China in terms of investment. Austria's The Press focused more on the service sector. They predicted that business related to services will grow even faster than commerce and investment once Vietnam opens its financial and telecom sector.
Why does the European Union have such a high requirement that Vietnam has to open the market, particularly in services and public procurement, while the interest of Vietnam is mainly in trades in goods?
It's because it has to be a balanced agreement. We have that Vietnam is a growing market. It's a market with focusing on manufacturing still. It's a market with a very young population, low labor cost. What we have from Europe is a very different type of a product set, if you want. We have services, we have high-tech goods. So it's a different concern that we have on the European side compared to with the Vietnamese side. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons why the FTA was concluded relatively swiftly, because our interests, they match each other quite well. What you export is mainly agricultural, tropical agricultural products, which we don't produce very much in Europe. It's low-cost labor products, which, again, we don't produce that much in Europe. And what we export to Vietnam are also products that are not being produced here in Vietnam. So I thought it was the perfect moment to have such an agreement, and I was very happy to see that on the two sides there was an understanding that this was actually a very good moment to sign up for an agreement.
What are the challenges to Vietnam as European products, investors and service providers enter the country following this FTA?
I think the challenge for Vietnamese producers is to continue to develop. That is, that they not rely only on low-cost labor products, but to move up the value chain. Vietnam has done extremely well in some electronic sectors, smartphones, as you are well aware. And I see that process continuing and being strengthened by the FTA, that Vietnamese producers will gradually move up, sell more expensive products on the European market.
How will the FTA influence Vietnam's market and investment environment?
I think if everything works well, we will have a more transparent investment climate in Vietnam. And that's going to benefit us, the European companies, but it will also benefit Vietnamese companies and other foreign companies. And most of all, it will benefit the Vietnamese economy. There will be a stronger reliance on the rules, which we have under the FTA. And there will also be a bigger knowledge of the Vietnamese economy. So you'll have some European companies that will be attracted by this FTA, and they probably locate themselves in Vietnam compared to some of the other places where they would have been tempted to locate without an FTA in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. What are the requirements the Vietnamese businesses have to meet in order to gain access to European market?
They have to be aware that the European market is a very sophisticated market. That means that the product standards tend to be quite high, especially if we talk about the safety issues. So that means foodstuff, quality of foodstuff has to be respected. And it's also standards that even in Europe, over time, tend to be more and more rigid. With better knowledge about the product safety issues, standards, they tend to increase over time. So that's important for the Vietnamese producers, that they adjust to that and that they don't try to fight that development, because it's a very natural development as countries grow richer. and they adjust to it in a constructive way. So far, we have been quite well served by the Vietnamese exports in those sectors. We have not had big issues on product safety with Vietnamese products.
In our following report, we will visit some Vietnamese companies to find out how they are preparing for the EV FTA.
To help Vietnamese enterprises meet the high standard from the European market, MUTRAP, or Multilateral Trade Assistance Project, ran by the EU delegation in Vietnam, has launched many training courses for better compliance with technical requirements. MUTRAP implements projects which will assist around 200 small and medium handicraft enterprises up to 2017 as part of the EU development aid. Ha Linh Rattan factory on the outskirts of Hanoi is one example. The company received the aid through Vietnam Gift and Housewares Association, also known as Vietcraft. Vietcraft is a gateway for importers worldwide to do business with handicraft exporters in Vietnam.
Vietcraft ấy, nhìn chung là hỗ trợ các doanh nghiệp rất là nhiều. Ví dụ cái hình thức đầu tiên ấy là gửi các cái nhà thiết kế xuống làm việc với doanh nghiệp để tạo ra các sản phẩm mới, các thiết kế mới phù hợp với lại thị trường yêu cầu. Và chúng ta có thể thấy đây là một trong những sản phẩm mà có sự hỗ trợ của Vietcraft. Thì họ gửi thiết kế xuống làm việc với doanh nghiệp, và mặc dù cái hoa văn này nó mang đậm cái bản sắc của Việt Nam nhưng rất phù hợp với thị hiếu của EU và của Mỹ.
MUTRAP also helps bring European experts to Vietnam to work with local designers and artisans to share their knowledge and insights of the EU market. These activities are co-organized by MUTRAP and the Ministry of Industry and Trade.
Các hoạt động hỗ trợ đã được triển khai toàn diện, hỗ trợ cho các doanh nghiệp Việt Nam đăng ký bảo hộ thành công nhãn hiệu sản phẩm nước mắm Phú Quốc, hỗ trợ cho các doanh nghiệp chúng ta tiếp cận thị trường châu Âu.
Phu Quoc fish sauce has been the first product in entire ASEAN countries that has been recognized in the European Union as a protected designation of origin, geographical indication. Means that only producer from Phu Quoc Island can export into the European Union the Phu Quoc sauce, labeling it as a Phu Quoc. To get the recognition, you have to prove the quality of your procedure, the novelty of your products in comparison to other similar products in the market.
Besides Phu Quoc fish sauce, coffee is another famous produce from Vietnam that needs to be recognized in the EU market.
Chúng tôi chọn làm chương trình công bằng để xuất khẩu cà phê mình cho các thế giới họ được biết cà phê thế nào là cà phê sạch, tính cách bền vững như thế nào. Về cà phê sạch là chúng tôi không dùng các loại hóa chất, là chúng tôi dùng phân hữu cơ trên vườn cây của chúng tôi. Chúng tôi sẽ giảm tối thiểu nhất về vấn đề phân vô cơ, vì phân vô cơ thì nó sẽ tác hại trên mảnh đất của chúng tôi. Cái sản phẩm của chúng tôi sẽ đến tận nơi cho người châu Âu biết rõ hơn xuất xứ nguồn gốc, để chúng tôi đẩy mạnh về vấn đề quản lý tính cách bền vững để sang cho châu Âu nhiều hơn.
Apart from geographical indication, Fair Trade is another certificate that can help develop a better branding for Vietnamese produce. Quality, not the pricing level, is the key for Vietnamese producers to consider when exporting to the EU market.
In a developed market like European Union, most of the profit are taken by distributors. So it's important to have a recognized product, a quality product for which the consumer is ready to pay more. If you're a producer of a fungible product and you can be replaced by anybody else, of course there will be a pressure to lower your price. Yeah? So the best, the higher is the quality, the higher is the recognition, the best it is for you to earn the profit.
The EV FTA includes a whole chapter dedicated to cooperation in implementing the agreement. How will the EU assist Vietnam in reaping the full benefits?
We have a number of measures in place. We have a very large trade project ongoing, MUTRAP it's called, which informs Vietnamese producers about the different regulatory requirements. It also helps the ministry to adapt to international standards and so on and so forth. And that program will be continuing for some years. and we have also new measures in place that would help.
Mm-hmm. As a developing country, Vietnam is granted a transitional period during which it can prolong its implementation of the commitments to the free trade agreement. What should Vietnam focus on during this period in order to make the most out of the opportunities from this agreement?
There's a transition period, but and it's a bit longer for Vietnam than for the EU, but on both sides there's a bit of time to adapt to the new regime. But that said, even from day one, in many sectors, there's very substantial openings from the start of the agreement. What Vietnam can do is to make sure that they look at these opportunities that will be coming up in future, and they adjust to them quickly, and they make the best out of this very rich European market that they will be facing on easier conditions than many other trading partners.
Mm-hmm. Sustainability is a cornerstone of the EVFTA. How can the two sides work towards the sustainable development?
We have a number of issues that we are working on there together with Vietnam. One, for example, is sustainable use of forestry resources, which is important in Europe and also in Vietnam. And there we have a negotiation going on right now with a labeling system, so that we make sure that wood products, furniture products exported from Vietnam are exported using sustainable wood products. So we have areas like that we are working on in parallel now that will kick in over the years to come.
Ambassador Yesim, thank you very much for taking your time to be with us in our show today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Following the agreement in principle, the two sides will finalize the legal text and resolve technical issues before the FTA can be officially signed. Signing this free trade agreement is equal to signing 28 other free trade agreements with 28 member countries of the EU, which include top global economies such as the UK, Germany and France. To take advantage of a high-quality playing field like this, Vietnam needs good preparation and long-term strategy for its export and manufacturing sector. And that just wrapped up this edition of Bizline. Thank you very much for being with us. Repeats of our show are all online at vtv4.vn or youtube.com/vtv4go. From our team here in Hanoi. Until next time.